This is the Energy Education Podcast for the week of October 21st, 2012. I'm Kevin Hurley. This podcast is a project of Fairwinds Energy Education. Fairwinds is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to educate policymakers, the public, and the next generation on matters of nuclear power and safety. This week on the podcast, the heavily damaged Unit 4 reactor at the Fukushima Daiichi complex suffered massive structural damage from the earthquake, tsunami, and explosion. Now, new information indicates that the integrity of the building may be getting worse. Also on the podcast, 4 nuclear reactors in the United States have been shut down for more than a year. We'll talk about why and what they all have in common. Joining us now to make some sense of this is Fairwinds Chief Nuclear Engineer, Arnie Gundersen. Arnie?
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
So we're starting out today talking about the Unit 4. A lot of people have been talking online. We've received a lot of emails about Unit 4. We know that following the accident, the whole, seaboard of Japan sunk about, how far? About a meter?
Yeah, about 100 miles of coast in Japan sunk a meter or 3 feet. Think about that. That's an amazing number. But the entire coastline of Japan dropped by 3 feet after the earthquake, which means that the tsunami was actually a foot higher, apparently, 3 feet higher than it was in reality, because the land had dropped by 3 feet before it ever hit.
But Unit 4 now, we know sinking more than that, or what's specific about Unit 4 if the whole seaboard sunk?
Yeah, there's been a lot of questions on our email this week about some quotes by Ambassador Murata about the fact that Unit 4 appears to be sinking even more. Now, I hadn't done anything about that because I wasn't sure until I checked with the source. But I wrote to Ambassador Murata, and he wrote back confirming that Unit 4 continues to sink. And he basically said, here, let me read his email to you. I've referred to the unequal ground sinking of 0.8 meters, which is a little over 30 inches, revealed by Matsuyo Matsuda, former secretary of the Prime Minister Khan. As you may recall, he attended the August 31st meeting that I had when I was in Tokyo, and then he made impressive comments. So Ambassador Murata goes on and he says, I've telephoned him and he confirmed the ground sinking, the source being a high-ranking official in the Nuclear Security Agency who was demoted for suggesting the possibility of a meltdown. So I have been able to confirm that there is unequal sinking at Unit 4. Not just the fact that the site sunk by about 36 inches immediately after the accident, but also that the Unit 4 continues to sink something on the order of 0.8 meters or around 30 inches.
What does that mean? Why is that
significant? These buildings are supposed to be seismically and structurally secure. And, if the ground sinks under them, that suddenly changes a lot of people's perceptions. The Unit 4 was damaged twice. It was damaged by all of the earthquakes that occurred. And it was also damaged by a series of explosions over the first week or two of the accident. So the building is structurally weakened. Now, Tokyo Electric's acknowledged that. They went in May and June of last year. This is more than a year ago, and put an enormous number of extra structural supports directly under the fuel pool to keep the bottom of the pool from breaking through. That's an indication that their seismic calculations were wrong all along. But now we're still seeing the building is buckled. It's about 2 inches wider at the bottom than it is in the top. And that's something called a first mode Euler strut buckle. It's a structural term. There was a crack in the foundation, and Tokyo Electric did a really poor job of trying to Photoshop the crack away. They literally tried tried to wipe it out, but a lot of people on the internet could see right through it.
So they fixed the problem.
That's how they fix the problem, is to Photoshop the crack away instead of solve the problem. And now this, of course, it makes the situation even more of a concern, because the building may not be sinking perfectly horizontally. It may begin to be tilting in a situation like this, which becomes an even bigger concern.
And of course, you've talked about Unit 4 quite a bit, and it's maybe more sensitive than the other buildings. What could be the possible consequence, I suppose, of Unit 4 becoming less structurally sound?
Yeah, well, Unit 4 has the most nuclear fuel in the fuel pool. It has no nuclear fuel in the nuclear reactor or in the containment. So all of the nuclear fuel is out of the reactor in the fuel pool. And it also has an entire hot nuclear core in the fuel pool, which is why it still steams on cold nights. You'll still see the steam coming off the fuel pool. So there's dozens of times more cesium in the nuclear fuel pool at Unit 4 than was ever released in all of the above ground testing that ever occurred. So if that pool were to face a structural damage from another earthquake, it would likely devastate Japan. We'd be back to we'd be back to 3/11, March 11th of last year, immediately, and have to again begin to worry about massive evacuation. So I've said before, it's a sleeping dragon, and we hope it stays asleep until the Tokyo Electric begins to empty the fuel. I don't think Tokyo Electric is thinking outside the box. I think they're way too traditional in how they're solving the problem of getting the fuel out. I think there's ways of doing it faster, and they're just way too methodical and too well, that's the way we've always done it, that's the way we're going to do it. And really, the whole world has got to keep their fingers crossed that we don't have another earthquake.
What should Tepco be doing right now?
Well, there's a couple things I think they could be doing. I think they could be considering moving the fuel with, instead of these 100-ton casks, which are enormous, which require an enormous crane. I think they could go with a smaller cask. And a cask is what you're storing the fuel in once it's removed from the fuel pool. Yeah, it's a device to lift the fuel out of the fuel pool. You can't just grab the fuel and pull it out, because it's so radioactive it would kill everybody within eyesight. So you put it in a shielded container. Well, Tokyo Electric is looking at huge shielded containers, something on the order of 105 tons. I think if they went with smaller containers and did more lifts, they could make dramatic changes in the building, and they could begin to do it a lot faster.
Can't fix this one with Photoshop, then?
No, this is not going to be Photoshopped away.
Arnie, Tepco just made an announcement. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah, more news coming out of Japan this week. Tokyo Electric announced, and it's been well reported on a lot of the news services. We have a link on the site to just one of the reports, but it was well reported on the news services that they've come to the conclusion that they knew that the site was in jeopardy, was unsafe since 2002. So they knew for 9 years that the site was unsafe, and that there was a severe tsunami damage, and they did nothing about it. Now, that shouldn't surprise the listeners to the Fairwinds site, because we were talking about that back in February when we wrote the report for Greenpeace, that there was ample warning. I actually think they knew in the 80s, but they're saying now they knew since 2002. But the interesting thing in the article is why they didn't do anything. So they knew internally that the site was unsafe, and they didn't do anything for two reasons. One is money. They didn't want to spend the money. But the second one is even more fascinating. They didn't want to create the perception that the site was unsafe. So therefore, they kept the site unsafe. And here's the exact quote from
Now this is from Tepco. This isn't a leaked document, internal document. They're announcing this themselves.
This came out this week, and so you got to give Tepco credit. They finally have looked in the mirror and realized just how poorly managed they really are. Yeah, this report is a Tepco report. These are Tepco words, not Greenpeace, not what Fairwinds wrote for Greenpeace. This is what Tepco now admits. Of course, 18 months later and $500 billion in damage, but this is what they now admit. There was a worry that that if the company were to implement a severe accident response plan, it would spur anxiety throughout the country and in the community where the plant was sited, and it would lend momentum to the anti-nuclear movement. So, just to recap here, Tokyo Electric knew it was unsafe and chose not to make it safer because it didn't want to create the perception that the plant was unsafe.
So it's interesting that this sounds like it started out as an internal document. It didn't get released to the public, and now after the fact, almost a year, 2 years later, it's now being released and admitted. How, I have to assume that the same sort of thing may be happening in the U.S., where when they know there's a safety concern, they just don't want to create a public uproar over it, so they keep the documents down.
Yeah, it's an amazing parallel because this week a Nuclear Regulatory Commission whistleblower came forward on almost the identical issue, and that's flooding of nuclear power plants. Now, you don't need the ocean to create a flood. It turns out that this whistleblower was aware of an internal NRC report that talks about there's 34 U.S. nuclear plants that are downstream of dams. And if those dams were to fail, it would wipe out the safety-related equipment in the nuclear plant, just like the tsunami wiped out safety-related equipment at Daiichi. So that report's was written by the NRC about 6 months ago, but it was classified not for public disclosure. So here's the NRC, America's nuclear watchdog, doing exactly what Tokyo Electric did, preventing the public from becoming aware of a safety problem because they don't want to frighten the public. So a courageous NRC employee came out and he said, this report was heavily redacted and there's all sorts of damning information in it. Now, listeners to the Fairwinds site shouldn't be surprised. I was on Robert Knight's show, 5 O'Clock Shadow. She's back about a year ago when Fort Calhoun was being flooded. And we talked about Fort Calhoun was completely surrounded by flooding, and there were 6 upstream dams that were full to capacity. Now, if one of those dams had failed, suddenly the flood that had surrounded the plant would have gone up by perhaps 10 or 20 feet. And or the wave that would hit the plant would disable it. Yet the NRC was basically telling everybody, don't worry, be happy. The probability of a dam failing is pretty low. But so is the probability of a 14-meter, 60-foot-high tsunami hitting Fukushima. We know that low probability events happen. And the NRC and Tokyo Electric both basically don't want to admit that these events can happen. And we've got 34 different Fukushimas in the United States. 1/3 of the nuclear fleet is in danger of an upstream dam failing. The worst case is the Oconee units. They're down in the southeast, and about 10 miles upstream from them is a huge hydroelectric dam. If it were to fail, the plants would be inundated by about a 50-foot high wall of water. So, of course, we had the Fort Calhoun flood. And I think you'll recall the saying I said that sandbags and nuclear power plants don't belong in the same sentence. We're talking about an event that if a dam were to fail, you don't have time to put up sandbags. Mm-hmm. You've got a wave moving down a valley, a river valley, that can jeopardize the plant. Before people can have a chance to react, the plant can be compromised.
Now, is this mainly about protecting the water pumps or just any and all equipment? What is the weak point as far as a flood?
Yeah, it's exactly what I've been saying since the accident, and it's that these pumps along the water would become inundated. The industry can solve this problem. The nuclear industry can put in submersible pumps. What I think they'll try to do is analyze the problem away and say, well, the probabilities are low, and therefore we don't have to make these changes. But they do sell pumps that run underwater, and the industry could put in pumps that could do that. There's also the switch yards that would be flooded as well. But if the switch yards were flooded and the pumps, the cooling pumps could still cool the diesels, you'd be okay. But what the industry has gotten in a situation now is where the switch yard would get destroyed and the pumps along the water would be destroyed, in which case there's no way to cool the plant, and we're right back to a Daiichi scale accident.
Well, since we're talking about the U.S., we've focused a lot on Fukushima, but what else can you say about the status of nuclear power in the U.S. right now? What's going on at home?
Well, this time of year, a lot of nuclear plants are in normal outages. They shut down about every 18 months to refuel. And they do it in the fall and the spring when there's not as much electric demand as in the spring or the summer. So this time of year, there's plants that are normally shut down. But in addition, there's 4 nuclear plants that are shut down for really long periods of time. Down in Florida, the Crystal River unit's been shut down since 2009. Engineers decided that they were going to replace something called the steam generator, a huge component. And that required cutting a hole in the containment. And rather than hire experts who had done this before, they decided to do it themselves. And it's sort of like, well, they slept at a Holiday Inn Express, so therefore they're capable of brain surgery. The net result was they cracked the nuclear containment. And then when they went to repair it, it cracked again and again. So now it looks like the Crystal River unit will be shut down for 5 years at least. And during which time the people in Florida are continuing to pay salaries of 1,000 people. The staff on that site is still there. Their salaries are still being paid for what? To generate nothing. It also shows a gross breakdown in quality assurance. I mean, these calculations should have been reviewed. Nobody caught an error that caused the containment to crack. The other one is Fort Calhoun. That was the one that was flooded. It was a good decision to keep the plant shut down as the flood came, but it also showed they had a fire in the cooling system for the fuel pool, and it also showed gross management failures at Fort Calhoun. The utility that owns it has basically admitted that they're incapable of operating it, and they've now hired a much bigger firm to take over and run it for them. But we would never have known that they were incompetent were it not for the Missouri River flooding. Where's the NRC? I mean, they had to know that this utility had no management strength and did nothing about it until something broke. And the other 2 units that are shut down are out in California. That's San Onofre 2 and San Onofre 3. And they were having their steam generators replaced as well. And when the units started back up, the tubes began to rattle. They heard the tubes rattling on something called acoustic monitoring and did nothing. The tubes rattled to the point where they broke and released some radioactivity. And now the units are shut down. To this week, Edison, Southern California Edison, announced that Unit 3 is not going to start up for a long time. And Unit 2, they're hoping will start up at 70% power after it's been shut down for a year. So again, we're back to the Crystal River thing. Ratepayers in California are paying $50 million a month for the salaries and the overhead structure at these power plants, and for a year they're not running. Well, $50 million a month times a year you're talking about $500 million. Ratepayers paid, and what do they have to show for it?
Just to keep one power plant open, though it's not generating.
Right. just to keep it, the opportunity to restart it. They've basically employed almost 2,000 people for a year, to the tune of $50 million a month.
You said that they initially heard this problem on acoustic monitoring, tubes rattling and such. Could they have, at that point, if they had addressed it, could they have stopped this from getting to where it was now?
The damage was done, but the tubes didn't have to leak and release radiation into the environment. They acknowledged that they heard the tubes, and they entered it into their corrective action program. What that means is they they wrote a note and put it in the computer saying, this is something we better look at. Well, nature doesn't work that way. Nature breaks when nature decides to break. So putting something in the corrective action program is not an adequate response when you hear pipes rattling inside a nuclear power plant. So so we're in a situation now where 4 nuclear plants out of 100 are shut down for more than a year in the U.S. And of course, there's 50 nuclear plants shut down in Japan, and the Germans have shut down another 9. So 60 nuclear plants are now just shut down after Fukushima out of the 400. So this concept of nuclear plants being dependable is really really questionable. We've got 60 nuclear plants shut down for more than a year, some forever, and yet we're still told by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and by the nuclear industry that these plants are safe, clean, and reliable.
Again, a problem that Photoshop can't fix, I guess, in this situation.
Yeah, you can't Photoshop the crack in the containment, and you can't Photoshop a flood, and you can't Photoshop cracks in the steam generator tubes. It just doesn't work that way.
All very real problems. Do you have any good news?
I was the senior manager for years, and listeners to the Fairwinds site would know that I was a senior VP in the nuclear industry, and I don't have any good news here. With all of these problems, 4 nuclear plants shut down for more than a year because of quality assurance problems. Basically, I mean, lots of people reviewed these calculations, and these plants are still breaking. What does that say about the quality assurance system? It shows, and then, of course, the dam issue and the 34 nuclear plants in jeopardy of dam failures, and Tokyo Electric's malfeasance in ignoring the fact that the plant could be inundated. All of this shows a gross management breakdown. And as a senior manager, I feel perfectly capable of saying that on the airwaves. These people don't know how to run their power plants. They're afraid to spend the money necessary to fix them, and afraid to spend it fast enough to get the problem done before people's lives are jeopardized. So to my way of thinking, it's been a bad news week for the nuclear industry in Japan and in the United States, and it just shows that the people we're counting on to protect us, the regulators and the people that own these power plants, can't be trusted.
Well, Arnie, you've been talking about this about Fukushima for almost 2 years now. This March, it'll be 2 years. For those people who are just joining, I know we have a lot of new listeners to the podcast. Can you just talk a little bit about Fairwinds, who you are, what it is that you do?
Yeah, my wife Maggie started Fairwinds years ago, and I came on full-time about 3 years ago. And I was always concerned about nuclear safety, and I was hired by the state of Vermont to evaluate their nuclear plant, Vermont Yankee. And in that capacity, I actually signed off saying that if they made 82 different, if they solved 82 different problems that we identified, they could continue to run for 20 more years. Then came Fukushima Daiichi, and that's when the video, the Fairwinds videos went up online. We are a nonprofit, and I was a nuclear whistleblower, so it's not like Maggie and I are sitting on some huge endowment or some some cushy retirement pension fund. We really could use listeners' contributions, large and small. I know there's listeners out there who are corporate execs and work for corporations who have the capability of making a large donation. I know there's many. We've received thousands of smaller donations, and I'm grateful every time I open a check on that. Thank you. But we don't run on vapor. And I hope that that this new concept of the downloadable podcast you can listen to on your iPod on the way to work will encourage people to go to the Fairwinds site and hit the donate button. We would really appreciate it.
Well, that about does it for this week. Arnie, thanks again for being here. The Energy Education Podcast is a project of Fairwinds Energy Education. I'm Kevin Hurley. Join us next Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern for more discussion of world nuclear events. Thank you.